Many a times I have debated with my friends in the theology department here at Union College about who wrote the book of Hebrews or who wrote other books in the Bible, especially in the New Testament. Although Paul wrote most of them, there is some dispute as to who wrote these books, as after all, they were written 2,000 years ago. And one of our professors here at Union College, who actually is the head of the religion department, is Dr. Benjamin Holdsworth. And he is an expert in New Testament subjects. And I decided to do an interview with him that ended up being wide-ranging, but certainly addressed some of those questions, especially the ones that I find interesting, such as who wrote the book of Hebrews? Was it Paul or was it somebody else? So I was very grateful to get to sit down with Dr. Holdsworth, and I hope you enjoy our conversation. I'm sitting here with Dr. Benjamin Holdsworth, who is the head of the religion department right here at Union College. I want to thank him, for joining us on What is Truth, and maybe you can just start off by introducing yourself a little bit so that the people listening know who you are.
Sure. I'm Ben Holdsworth. I'm professor of religion at Union College and program director. I'm also have a background in New Testament and a mixed experience in both business and in religion and theology. So have a wide-ranging background, lived a few places in my lifetime, not just here in Lincoln, Nebraska. So have a lot of places that I've traveled and been, and many of them intersect with the New Testament.
Yeah, it's cool that you have the business side as well, because I'm trying that out right now with my degree to do a little bit of the business. Have you found that beneficial?
Always.
Good.
Yeah,
okay.
Anytime you have an opportunity to gain experience in business, it'll become directly applicable in whatever you do in ministry.
Cool.
And so financial statements, people, negotiation, understanding human relations, all comes into play.
Sure.
And it will be part of the fabric of wherever you go next, especially running board meetings. So so it's key piece.
So what is it exactly that brought you? Because there's a lot of different paths. Presumably you start out with a theology bachelor's degree. Is that kind of where it started?
So for me, the calling to look at ministry and go into sharing the gospel, sharing good news of Jesus, started back in academy, and and academy professors, academy teachers who were influential in my life. That led into looking at ministry as my undergraduate degree. So I ended up with a BA in theology. But at the same time, because I was interested in teaching, I also ended up with minors in history and social studies and secondary education.
Okay.
So that I was fully qualified to teach at a high school level when I finished my degree. So I didn't immediately go into ministry. And so what I did was worked a little bit in Maryland after I graduated.
Okay.
Moved to Florida when my wife got the first job that was matching to our careers. So we worked on this assumption of whoever got the career in their field first, that's where we moved.
Okay.
So that's how we ended up in Florida.
Okay.
And in Florida, I taught for 3 years at a junior academy, a year at the Adventist Academy in Apopka, Florida. And then after that, went into business, and in the meantime, I ended up with an MBA. So I picked up a master's in business administration, and then I spent 13 years. Let's see, 11 years. 13 when I throw in the consulting side. So 13 years in dealing with healthcare, strategic planning, and business development, looking at markets, market analysis, antitrust. And so the whole mix of merger and acquisition analysis, etc. So for 13 years, that and 11 years for Evan Health or Florida Hospital, and then 2 years consulting before God and I had a different conversation.
So at what point, if at all, did you do just pastoral ministry? Was that something in the cards for you from the beginning, or?
No, my original calling was to teach. Everybody knew that.
Okay.
So I did my pastoral ministry in 88 to 2000, or 98 to 2001.
Okay.
And so that came after the career in healthcare. So my move back into pastoral ministry came in Florida. So I worked for Florida Conference pastoring 2 churches for 3 years, and became ordained, and then moved to England to work on my master's in New Testament and then my PhD in New Testament.
And where did you do that in England?
Well, the master's was done at Newbold College.
Newbold,
as part of the Open University program, and so that started the process of looking especially at biblical backgrounds and understanding the master's thesis was in the issues of the book of Ephesians and for a setting for the book. Where, if you're looking at the book, does it have a reasonable setting, a reasonable way in which it's actually read in Ephesus or in that region? And so that was the purpose of that. After that was finished in 2001, then we moved to Durham in the north of England, and I went to the University of Durham for working on my doctorate, and that doctorate was in Romans. And especially the social context in reading the book.
Sure.
And so that was a few years of muttering and 367 pages that were the edited version of what the doctorate looked like.
Okay. So teaching was always in the cards for you. That was kind of the beginning.
Teaching was always in the cards. I even though I went into healthcare, I taught Sabbath schools most of those years. That I wasn't involved in a classroom, even when I was involved in a classroom, still teaching in church practically every week for most of that time. And in a couple of those churches, those classes were fairly large. So in one church, we had about 85 people in Sabbath school on Sabbath. And there were 4 of us in that team who taught, and it was a really, really great group, a really great Sabbath school. Lots of interaction and a lot of biblical study. We didn't follow the traditional quarterly. But what we did was we took the topic of that quarter, then we worked at the issues. Using a very wide range of material and approaches and how we would deal with it. So it was a unique group, but it was an interesting setting to go from an 85-member Sabbath school to a 40-member church. And so it was just a way of experiencing a different kind of change. Lord opened the doors for all that to happen.
So then, I guess, when did you start at Union College? When did that happen?
So I was finishing up my doctorate and hadn't started looking yet. And so there's a longer story there, but I came here in July of 2009.
And
have been here since.
And you just became the head of the program last
year?
Became
program chair last June 1.
Last June 1 precisely, yes. Because it's that recent that you
started. Well, the cycle for academics is May 31 to June 1. Back up. June 1 to May 31 cycle. So that's the way it works.
And here you teach, if I remember correctly, the main ones that at least I know that I'm going to be involved with are like Christian ethics, New Testament epistles. What other classes do you teach that I'm missing?
Not ones you likely will teach or take, but my mix of classes has shifted through time. So right now in the fall I teach biomedical ethics, mostly for people going into direction in healthcare. And so that's a different mix of topics in the course that primarily deal with the issues of medicine and worldview within healthcare. So that I teach that in the fall. I teach a course called Global Environment International Policy in the fall that looks at the intersection of 3 disciplines. So it's the intersection of religion, science, and looking at the issues of the environment, and then the whole issues of policy making from an international perspective in regard to those issues in conversation with the Bible. And then the third class I teach is medical ethics for the physician assistant program. And so that is at a master's level.
Gotcha.
So that'll be a master's level course for that program. And then this coming year that gets split, so it'll be partially master's of public health and PAs in the same class. So now I got a new dynamic of figuring out how to teach 2 groups of people at the same time. which will be fun. I'm looking forward to the challenge. Spring is New Testament epistles, which you'll take.
Yes.
And then what else I teach in spring? Spirituality and healthcare, which is a course that's looking at the dynamics of the practice of spirituality, primarily geared for occupational therapy assistant program, but also for other people who are going into other professions. So I've got, in the current class, I've got social work, religion, nursing, computer science, OTA, and what I forget? Oh, pre-PA. So I've got a mix of 21. I've got 21 students, and I have a mix of multiple disciplines that are in there. But it's primarily about the idea of how do you practice a spiritual life to engage in a way that will help people heal.
Yeah.
Traditionally, I taught Romans in the spring.
Right. I've heard about that class.
So I had a class that I taught previously before I became program chair, dealing with Paul and his letters. Half the semester was Romans. And so, unfortunately, that's not in the mix right now.
Okay.
And then I teach general Christian ethics in the spring. So I got Christian ethics, spirituality and healthcare, New Testament epistles in the spring, and then logistics, as I call it, because just being program director, you're thinking about policy, logistics, following up with people, getting things done.
Emails.
A lot of emails.
A lot of emails.
At different days and hours of the night, night or day, and just trying to help things happen and go well for people. Right. So that's kind of the mix. And then in the summer, usually teach a summer section of Christian ethics.
Okay.
This year, not doing that, but I am doing part of the UK study tour.
Yes.
So this summer it'll be a course called Monks, Martyr, and Reformation. And so we're going to go explore pieces of England this summer and look at the intersection of religion and spirituality and people who have practiced those, and look at those stories, those people inside the setting, the circumstances that they were in. So it'll be interesting. I think it'll be fun. It's still a process of development.
Right.
But at the same time, as it comes together, I think it'll be a really interesting experience.
Oh yeah, it's always cool to imagine to teach something when you're actually there on the ground, as opposed to you're sitting here in Lincoln, Nebraska, talking about what happened on the other side of the world, and you wish you could be there.
So we will read the story of the death of Thomas Cranmer, his burning at the stake, and we will stand at the spot where he was burned to have a conversation about faith and the practice of faith, and understanding that in the context of him making the decision that he was willing to die for what he believed. And it's an interesting story, but it had a profound impact.
Oh yeah. I think back, a lot of those martyrs, even their quotes, I think I got it right, at least it was Polycarp when he was burned. He said, 86 years have I served him, and he's done me no wrong. How now can I blaspheme my Lord and King? And I admire that, because none of us really in our position where we're threatened to be burned at the stake. But there have been in the past Christians who were.
So we'll talk about monks. John Wycliffe comes to mind. Martyrs, Cranmer, and then we'll talk about bits and pieces of Reformation on that trip. So Wycliffe was at Oxford. The beginnings of Methodism occurred at Oxford. And so we'll be in Oxford and in the churches where the men preached and take a look at those experiences of what it's like to read part of what they preached in the space and where they did it.
Right.
So part of the fun.
So I think if we focus in, I'm also very interested in the New Testament era with the epistles and things like that. I could see myself going down a similar track. I love that stuff. And the question that I know probably has a simple answer but would still be interesting to dive into, I even see a book behind you on the shelf there that says, who wrote the Bible? And there's some books in the Bible where we're really not sure. And a good example of that is the book of Hebrews. So I'm going to ask you this question knowing that there's not going to be a satisfying answer, but who do you think wrote the book of Hebrews?
You need to take my New Testament epistles class.
There's a fee to get into this part.
Well, there is, but it's required. So sooner or later we'll have this conversation. Hebrews is an interesting book because of the way it's positioned. We get a hint of setting in the last chapter. There's been lots of theory because we don't have a writer at the beginning.
No.
We don't have a statement, fully a statement about people at the end. So it makes setting a little more complicated. But because of style and approach, it could be a range of people. So the traditional narrative is Paul, but it's very different than the other Pauline letters.
Right.
It's a different book than Romans, and it's dealing with text differently. So there's a whole conversation of scholarship that maybe Paul, but lots of other competition for the lead in this. There have been conversations about Luke writing Hebrews, conversations about Silas writing Hebrews. There's been even hints by some that a woman wrote Hebrews. And so you've got probably about 6 or 7 different competing narratives about who wrote the book. All I think I can say is with some certainty, whoever wrote it is someone well-versed in Judaism and well-versed in Christianity, in being able to bring together themes that celebrate and cement Jesus as the focal point of ministry in heaven and also the one who walks with people on earth and helps them be ready for the day in which the Lord returns. And so I look at it thematically as much as saying, okay, who wrote it? Because I can't answer that question with any certainty.
Right.
But even though it's fun to talk about.
It is.
But at the same time, I have to look at, what's the overall context, what's the overall approach of this letter, in this book, and then what do we take from it? What do we gain from this in its setting? And so the timing of the letter matters. And so depending on when you think it's written, it has a different kind of impact. So if it's written prior to destruction of Jerusalem, for example, in 70, you have a competitive status between the writing of this book pointing to Jesus in heaven versus the temple that still stands on earth. If it's written after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70, it's helping Christians who were embedded within Judaism reshape their focus from the destroyed temple in Jerusalem and cement that perspective on the temple that stands in heaven where Christ is. And so there's, I think, the deeper piece of thinking about Hebrews is about understanding that need for the book to be written, to reaffirm the focus on Jesus, and also in context of what's going on in that mid to late 60s and early 70s period in Christian history.
Isn't it fair to say probably that much of the New Testament hinges a lot on that 70 date, on certain events? Like, for example, the book of Acts, it ends abruptly. It's strange that it ends abruptly. There's things missing at the end of Acts, right?
Well, we think there's things missing at the end of Acts because of how it ends. But you have to, and again, there's a whole bunch of stuff in Epistles that you'll see later.
Right.
And so you're getting a preview now. But if you look at what happens in the early Christian church in Rome between 60 and 64, you have the writing of the Gospel of Luke and the writing of Acts, and it's intended to be a 2-volume work.
Right.
Okay. You have Mark write, mostly perhaps influenced by Peter.
And probably earlier than Luke Acts, most likely.
Well, there's the conversation. Is this earlier or is it not? Is it contemporary, which is another conversation because we have the whole conversation of Mark and primacy, but then you have the whole conversation of what would it look like to have 2 contemporaries writing Gospels
if they're writing
at the same
time? Yeah.
Because Mark has to write before the fire in Rome in 64.
Yeah.
And Luke has to finish his work before the fire in Rome in 64.
Yep.
And at the same time, Paul's writing the prison epistles. So you got Ephesians, you got Philippians, you got Colossians, you got Philemon.
Yep.
Right? So, and you have the book of Laodicea, which we don't have, the letter to Laodicea.
Is that a letter that
Colossians.
Paul is said to have written, Laodicea?
Well, we know he did.
Okay, yeah, because I'm not as familiar with that word.
Well, it's the end of Colossians 4.
Okay.
Because he says, after you've read your letter, share with Nymphe and Laodicea, and read the letter I wrote to them. So we have Paul actually telling us he wrote the letter.
He wrote a letter to Laodicea.
Yeah, but we don't have it. It's lost. And there may be a good reason why it's lost, because of the earthquake that occurred in the area of Laodicea and Colossae in 63, which destroyed the city. Okay, it destroyed Laodicea. And so it was so impactful that the city actually had the emperor Nero offer to rebuild, and they said, no, we got the money, we'll do it ourselves.
Right. Yes.
Okay, so here we have a setting for why we might have lost the letter to Laodicea, why we don't have a copy of it. It might have been buried in that event, which gives us an idea of the setting of those prison epistles being written likely late 62, early 63, and then sent on to the cities. So we have this burst of writing. We have this confluence of church leadership, both Peter and Paul in the city, along with these other writers who are summarizing the life of Jesus and preparing letters that would help influence the church. And then perhaps the most important part is this whole thing of what we do with Onesimus. And the letter of Philemon sometimes is far more important than we realize, but that's a longer story. So what happens in Rome in that late 60s period, this again before the fire in Rome, but also before the revolt begins.
Right.
And so there's kind of this set of importance that comes before the trauma that we see come to the church or come to Judaism with the destruction. Well, first of all, with the revolt, which again is a more complicated story than just a revolt against Rome.
Right.
But then also the destruction of Jerusalem in 70.
And there's other events, too, that you would think would be, in theory, in Acts, depending on when it's written, like the death of Paul and Peter, right? Because Eusebius records that Peter died on a cross and that Paul was beheaded, correct?
Yeah, so, you have to think about, why does Luke write these two volumes at this particular time? And so one of the things to think about, and you have to, this is your preview for taking epistles.
Yeah.
One of the reasons why Acts is written is to demonstrate a couple of things. One, Christianity is innocent of any charges that can be brought by the empire. The second, Paul is innocent. And the way Paul is innocent is to show the illegalities and irregularities of all the circumstances that Luke relates that he goes through that do not match Roman law, including all three trials.
Or Paul's constantly saying, I'm a Roman citizen,
Well, there's that, but being reinforced in there, and there's a whole set of legal complications about him saying it. But at the same time, he has trials before three governors, which create the legal briefs that can be used in the narrative of Paul's defense before either the emperor or his representative in Rome when he is tried. And so if you think about Acts as a way of illustrating the history, portions of the history of the early Christian church, but specifically about the issues of Paul not being prosecuted and tried and convicted under Roman law, it establishes the book not as a history as much as an approach to demonstrate the leading of the Holy Spirit, and also that Paul is not guilty of breaking Roman law.
Right. Okay. So, that's an interesting point that I think the majority of Christians today don't think about. They just think of the book of Acts as one of the history books. It's kind of odd thrown out there. Most don't even realize that Luke wrote Acts, much less that Acts could be viewed as a legal defense for Paul, because Paul is essentially on trial as Luke is writing this, that he's actively being persecuted by the Roman government. And that's certainly a twist that adds a lot of layers that are interesting.
Well, it's interesting because as we look at those chapters, what Luke is documenting is that he has appealed to the emperor, which is his right as a Roman citizen.
Mm.
And so he is carrying out his right. Festus and Herod Agrippa II in Luke's narrative are making it clear that there were really no criminal charges to bring against Paul.
Mm-hmm.
And so he is sent to Rome, but what Luke is substantiating, and there are probably other legal documents that would have gotten the centurion, that Paul does not have a basis of being tried under Roman law and should be released. And so there's the hint that's being given without trying to create the full legal summary. But because he brings back the Jewish leadership in the last chapter in Acts 28, the Jewish leadership of Rome saying, we don't know anything about this guy doing anything wrong. He's reinforcing the message that the process of illegality also stretches to the Jerusalem leadership. And they too carried out processes that did not incriminate nor punish or bring about consequences of death to Paul. In fact, what they engaged in was illegal activity in regard to his case, which shows again that injustice has occurred towards this person who is a Roman as well as being Jewish. And so is Paul held? Yes. Is he held under house arrest? Yes. But in this first set of circumstances where Christians are not seen as a illegal religion, Paul is treated within his rights as a Roman citizen who is awaiting trial.
Right.
And so that's the reason why the book is so interesting, is we have all this nuance sitting in the background of saying, how do we think about this if Theophilus, for example, is a person who is somehow related to the circumstances in which Paul will be heard. And now we have a different kind of lens to think about Luke and Acts. So if we think about the reason why there's these two letters, and then we think about Theophilus, if Theophilus is someone who is tied into the process of looking at Paul's case or Paul's trial from the Roman context, we now have a perspective of Christianity being explained, and the history of Christianity around Paul being explained in a way that would support Paul's innocence.
Okay, that's really interesting too, because there is debate over whether Theophilus was an individual or whether it was just kind of this concept, because it means lover of God, right, in Greek.
Yeah, friend of God, lover of God. And so here we have a different set of nuances, different set of circumstances we have to grapple with. And so it's helpful to read Acts with some understanding of how Roman law works in the first century. And there's some good writers who've done work in that area and explored that intersection. It's very worthwhile.
And that's why you should come to Union College and take New Testament epistles so that you can learn all of that.
Oh, we touch on it. I mean, there's never time in a general survey class.
Yeah, never.
And even as it is, there's some letters that have to just be skipped just because there's too much. So unfortunately, don't have time for James, but do get Jude in.
So
that gets neglected.
Oh, yeah, they both. I mean, Jude especially gets neglected, right?
Yeah.
I had a thought about James that I kind of wanted to poke your brain about a little. If I remember correctly, and I could be wrong, but didn't Martin Luther want to remove the book of James because it was too works-based?
You've now wandered.
I know, I've wandered to a totally different area. I know.
This is a hazard of wandering into something that I don't know much about.
Okay.
and the reason why I say I don't know much about it is not because I don't remember bits and pieces of the narrative, but what happens in life, and especially when you're doing work at a deeper level, there's just no way to keep up with everything across the entire spectrum. Yeah. So I spend most of my time in my reading muttering about what's happened in either late Second Temple Judaism or within the time period of that first, 8 decades, down about the 90s at the latest, the 90s CE, and in the first century of early Christianity, but also that century of empire.
Okay.
So, you get down to the end of Nero, I'm like, okay, have fun.
It's out of my area of expertise.
I haven't looked at, I know about these other guys, Titus, etc.
Yeah.
So I'm aware of that, and I've done reading in it. But if you said, well, can you now go off and expound or elaborate on what's going on in the medieval period or in the circumstances around Martin Luther, I'd be like, go talk to a church historian, because that is not my area.
Sure.
You want to know some more stuff about first century and reason why shipwrecks mattered in November? We can have a conversation about that, and why those circumstances around Paul's travel in that last chapter of Acts, chapters 27, 28, was important to the story, and all the nuances, or a number of the nuances that are lurking in the story that are significant to the first reader. You can talk about that, but if you wanted to know what Martin Luther was doing at any point in time period in between 1615 and 1625, I'd be like,
I don't know.
Not me. Go talk to another guy.
Sure.
But that's the hazard of scholarship and what you focus on.
Because you would be more inclined to have studied the Book of James itself as opposed to Martin Luther's response to the Book of James. Right. Yeah.
It doesn't mean that reading Martin Luther's response to the Book of James or having him want to cut it out of the Bible isn't worthy topic. It is.
No.
But it's something of, you have to make choices. And so my choice was to go first century context of reading the letters versus saying, can I keep up with the rest of church history? And my humble admission is no.
Okay, well then, so the letters, there was one other thing about the letters that I find interesting, and I totally am just following little rabbit trails in my brain because I find it fun. We haven't talked about John much, whether you're talking about the Gospel of John or the Book of Revelation. I see you sighing already. I have no idea how you'll respond to this, but I'm curious what you might have to say about the authorship of John versus Revelation. I find authorship very interesting, and I think the reason I do is because we don't know enough.
When we're done with this, I'll hand you something.
Okay.
So the issues of authorship is, again, going back to what's the intent of the writer and what are the circumstances of the surrounding period.
Yeah.
So is it possible that John writes Revelation? Yes.
Yeah.
And the writer, at least the account that we have in Revelation, leans us towards the assumption of saying
that it's
John the Apostle is the one who wrote this book. And we have some evidence out of early church history in that early 2nd century period that says, this was John the Elder. So there we have a basis of saying it's the same guy.
Right.
Okay. So then you have to say what kinds of settings are there that help us understand why John would write a gospel when he does, and what is it that he's trying to do with that gospel if the other three are in existence. Okay. So we're assuming that Matthew, writing to a Jewish audience, for example, Mark and Luke to non-Jewish audiences primarily. Doesn't mean Jews don't read it. They do.
Yeah.
But there we have this setting in which now John is wanting to reinforce the message of love.
Yeah.
And reinforce people having and holding on to faith in Jesus. So there's a good reason why he would write a gospel. Does it happen the same time he writes the book of Revelation? Maybe, but most likely not. 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, different circumstances for those letters, written likely to a narrower audience than the gospel is intended for. But Revelation can have a setting.
Yeah.
And so if we're down to late 2nd century, or late 1st century, sorry, and looking at what's going on in the empire, who is ruling, and what the circumstances are in the empire, both in relationship to Christianity, relationship to Judaism, but relationships in the empire itself between its leadership, we have a setting in which the book of Revelation makes very good sense to the readers of the book, but also their concerns in the time period about what's happening in the world, about the insistence of worship by Domitian. And Domitian is someone who's persecuting people, not just Christians. And there's Rita Suetonius gives you hints, or Tacitus. And so here we have sets of narrative that creates a flavored context for how we hear Revelation in relation to that time period where people are being challenged from lots of different directions about holding on to or being faithful to Christianity in the face of these challenges. And so the book provides hope and comfort and a refocus on Jesus. So that's why it's called the Apocalypse. All right. Of
Jesus Christ.
Well, there we go.
Right,
it's the revelation of Jesus Christ. But it's a reminder of the coming of Christ as the one who is supreme and over all things in the face of an emperor who was saying, I want you to worship me. And if you don't, I will kill you. Right? So I'm summarizing a certain perspective of Domitian. But at the same time, while we look at it as prophetic and look at the prophetic material, it's first written as prophecy to this group of people who are here in the early to mid to late 90s saying what we are going through seems unsustainable, and how long will we go through this? When does Jesus come back? So there's a conversation longer than you thought, but at the same time, it helps us think about authorship and think about how we grapple with what the content of letters are, and then what that helps us learn, what it helps us see in relationship to them.
Because we have the majority of the New Testament written by Paul. Correct. Is it the majority, or is that kind of debated too, depending on which? The percentage I think is around 50, isn't it?
No, I think it's a little less than that.
But, do you?
but the thing again, you come back to this issue of authorship, and then debates within modern scholarship around authorship of certain Pauline letters, and so the whole breakdown of the Pauline versus Deuteropauline, who's the second Paul guy, who writes like Paul but may not be Paul, which is the conversation in modern scholarship of, for example, in Ephesians, does Paul write Ephesians or not? Is this somebody else mimicking Paul? Because we assume that Paul wrote Romans, and we assume that he wrote Galatians, and then we have these folks that would like to debate a number of the other letters that are left.
Well, we could go all day going down all these little rabbit trails, but what I'm hearing is, the authorship is not the most important thing. It's the context and the message, and I think we could have easily ended off on what you were saying about the book of Revelation and John, and those are beautiful works, both the Gospel of John and the book of Revelation, regardless of who wrote them. So looking at the time, we could probably end off right about here, but I really appreciate the insight, Dr. Holdsworth. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you. Glad to be here. And hope people are blessed by our conversation.
Hope so too. Thank you.
Thank you.